Hey guys, we're back.
Hey.
Book number 3.
Yes.
Yes.
The Big Fat Surprise by Nina. Is it Teicholz?
I just call her
I've heard it both
Teicholz.
ways. I've heard it Teicholz and Teicholz.
Okay. Well, Miss Nina wrote a book and we're going to review it. We're doing chapters 1 through 3 today.
Yes.
So,
and this is a hearty book.
It is very hearty.
It is. There's
Yeah.
lots of good info in there. Do we have anybody yet in the chat? I'm not seeing anybody. We posted. I posted our link a little late this week, guys. Apologize for that, but I had to work yesterday and today until 3, so I was just like rushing around trying to get here. But anyway, we will hopefully some people will join us.
Hopefully. If not, they'll catch it on the replay.
Yeah, if not, we'll just talk to ourselves. So we're good at that.
It's been 2 weeks since we met. We finished up Dr. Barry's book. Oh, yay. Hello.
Hey.
So this is good. This is a good one. And, I always wait kind of till the last minute to get my reading done because then it's more fresh in my mind. And I completely underestimated how long it was going to take to do the reading for this book because it's very fact-based and very, it's not the easy reading like Dr. Barry's book was.
No, it's quite
super
involved.
Yeah.
And like chapter 1 was like to me it was kind of like an average length, so to speak. But then when you got into chapter 2, that I was like, oh my gosh, and it's awesome.
Yes.
And very fascinating. And I had to go back and reread some stuff. And in chapter 3, though, a lot of it I already knew, although there were some things I didn't. But anyway, it is very intense reading, I think, especially chapters 2 and 3 so far. I mean, I think she kind of eased us in chapter 1.
No, but it's been really, really good. And I know, did you guys read the introduction?
No, I didn't.
I listened to it. Yeah.
Oh yeah,
I did not.
I had a couple things I underlined from the introduction that I thought might be, since we're starting at the beginning.
Sure. Let's do that.
Yeah.
Right.
So I really, just one really key point, which I think is going to show through as she goes through and discusses all the things that she's going to discuss. But on page 4, like the second full paragraph, she said researchers she's talking about these people who are researching the, nutrition. She says researchers who persisted in their challenges found themselves, and this is challenging the whole fat is bad idea, found themselves cut off from grants, unable to rise in their professional societies, without invitations to serve on expert panels, and at a loss to find scientific journals that would publish their papers. Their influence was extinguished and their viewpoints lost. And then I thought this was really key. As a result, for many years, the public has been presented with the appearance of a uniform scientific consensus on the subject of fat, especially saturated fat. But this outward unanimity was only made possible because opposing views were pushed aside. So we have, I'm sure she's going to further develop that idea throughout the book about how this all came about, that there has been. And so when you hear about scientific consensus about a particular fact, it's really that the opposing viewpoints have been suppressed.
Yes. And so this brings me to the most prominent message that I got from reading these 3 chapters. If I had to sum up these 3 chapters in a little sentence, it would be, they're all in bed with each other.
Yes. I was thinking the good old boys club.
The good old boy network.
And they will crush anybody.
You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. And it just makes you realize that they're just human beings, just like all the rest of us, who at our jobs, we want our friends to be working over here with us. And we want our friends to, I'll appoint you to this, or, it's like that everywhere.
And it's also when we start giving accolades, to then step back and admit we were wrong is not human nature.
Yeah. It's not at all. It's
Yeah.
quite disturbing, but it says so much about human nature. And then it's also quite refreshing to know that we're not all crazy.
Yes.
Right.
It's like, oh, okay, so there is some corruption. I didn't just imagine this, because when you get the standard message of, this is the way it is. I don't know what's wrong with you, but this is the way it is. And they're all saying it just like little robots. After a while, you're like, am I crazy?
Yeah. Am I just?
I mean, maybe
nuts?
it's me. I
Mhm.
tend to doubt myself before I doubt the next guy, especially if he's got a bunch of letters behind his name,
That's
But
true. It
I'm
makes you,
starting
it
to
does make you
rethink
question
that in my
yourself.
midlife.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So, yeah, so she did give some statistics and about, the oils, her talking about the bringing vegetable oils into our diet. I guess I didn't necessarily realize how later in this happened, because I know we talked about margarine before in the other one of the other books we were reading about how it was like right after World War II, and the vegetable oils and how they were really like we went from like zero. Everybody used to just use animal fats,
Mm-hmm.
and we went from like zero. And she said it wasn't until really the 1970s that people started to increase their vegetable oil, even their fruit and vegetable intake, the percentage, reducing their fat. But then also we had a huge increase too in disease. And she said during the same decades where they started increasing all of these other oils, she said the rates of diabetes went from like less than 1% of the adult population to more than 11%. And then, of course, heart disease became the leading cause of death. And so it's like there was a correlation between increasing these types of foods away from animal foods to plant-based foods and the rise of these diseases. So, but anyways, those are just a couple points from the introduction that, yeah. But I did a couple slides in, because I didn't like her that made the sources of fat look like this in the book.
Yeah.
So I got an external source to show, because I figured
Hold on, I'm having trouble hearing.
You're having trouble hearing? So we stopped talking.
Yeah, so now she doesn't know she hears us or
Audio.
not.
We're having technical difficulties.
Hey, mess with her and just start doing like this, going.
Okay.
Oh my
All right.
goodness.
We'll just roll with it. We'll make it.
Oh. You can't hear us, huh?
Well, I guess I should have read the introduction. I'm ashamed to say that I didn't, but I'm just being honest.
Okay. Sorry, guys. I couldn't hear anything at all.
Oh no.
Could you all hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh yeah, we could hear you.
Okay.
Could you
repeat? Run it back just a few seconds here.
We were joking around. Chris, Carrie was saying that we should just mouth things. So I was doing some mouthing, and
because we stopped talking, and then it was
like silence.
Yeah. So then you wouldn't have.
Yeah, no, we were just talking about the parallel she brings in the introduction to the rise, like getting away from plant-based fats and other foods to animal-based going to plant-based, and the rise in disease. Diabetes going from less than 1% of the population to over 11%, heart disease being the leading cause of death. And that there's definitely this positive correlation between the introduction of more plant-based foods, plant-based fats, and the rise of these diseases. But I also was about to talk about the first slide, because I was showing that her little diagram here isn't very good. So I brought in one from the outside source, but it's really funny too, because obviously this outside source is biased because they have the red X's
They sure do.
next to the trans fats and the saturated fats, and then the big old nice healthy check under the unsaturated fats. But she kind of in her book explains like kind of which foods fall into the different categories. So I thought it might be helpful to at least have this slide available, just because we're going to talk about the difference. But the saturated fats and are where the animal fats are. So and some other things like the coconut oil and the palm oil, and but when we eat a really low carb or carnivore diet, we're focusing, most of our fat comes from this. In fact, probably all of our fats, I'm guessing, comes from the animal fats, which falls under the saturated fats. Now, this source claims that the unsaturated is the ones that are like seed oils, other than olive oil, and avocado, but the rest are seed oils, and then there's fish are the healthy ones. But she's going to show us otherwise. And then I have one more slide just to show really basic, super, super simple. Because she goes into more detail about what saturated versus unsaturated is. And basically unsaturated means that there's like empty spaces in the chain. Like there's opportunity. There's these double bonds. So you can see like the little equal sign between those two carbon atoms is a double bond. I guess those double bonds are weaker and they have an opportunity to pull in and bind with some other things that necessarily aren't good for you. Whereas the saturated fats are very stable. And it also determines too, like their structure at room temperature. Like the saturated fats tend to be more solid at room temperature. They form really tight bonds, and they are every single carbon atom is fully bonded with the hydrogen atoms. So it's a little bit. She brings out illustrations of this in the book, but I didn't think they were that great, and I don't think we need to know anything more than just this is the only difference, you know. And she talks about monounsaturated, meaning there's like one free bond or one double bond. Polyunsaturated means there's more than one double bond. And
this reminds me of just the ridiculousness of how people think that when you eat saturated fats that they're just going to like stay solid in your body, when literally when you heat them up as our body would, what do? They don't stay solid.
Yeah.
They turn to a liquid pretty quick,
Yeah.
That's true. And of course, the old commercials where it shows the globs of fat going down a drain. I'm sure you've seen that before, like, showing
it doesn't.
And it's like, that's not how our bodies work at all. I mean, the fat doesn't even
the
make
stomach acid
far.
And the all of our breaking down,
because they think because it gets solid at room temperature that it's just going to clog your arteries. But that's a very good, Lynn, that's a really good visual there, because she did go into a lot of detail about that.
Yeah. And I figured I didn't think we needed to go into all this detail that she went into it.
We don't need to know this on a biochemistry level.
No, this is now.
I learned this in biochemistry, but like I don't carry it with me every day. You know?
This is as much biochemistry as I care to know.
Yeah.
But anyway, so just this, because we hear a lot about saturated and unsaturated fats, and I'm sure she'll talk about trans fats and all that. But anyway, so that's basically it for the slides for today. I figured at least to have a couple of full colored visuals.
Well, thank you for
those
doing
things.
that.
Yeah. Okay. So chapter 1. So I know she goes into, I really appreciate the fact that she goes into a lot of history on the whole, like, humanity's views on fat. And it was one thing I learned from chapter 1. She starts talking about the and I'm going to butcher his name, this Swedish anthropologist, Wilhelmer Stephenson.
You did very well. I've heard it pronounced, but it's kind of hard for me to get it out. So you sound correct.
I don't know. Anyways, 1906, he was a guy who went to go live with the Inuits because he wanted
Mhm.
to observe their health and their diet.
Where are
And
you right now? I'm just
page
curious.
9,
Okay.
yeah,
So,
the first page of chapter 1.
okay. So at some point I want us to tell like a little bit about her,
Oh
like
yeah,
what
definitely.
who she is, why she's writing this. And that's in the introduction.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
See,
And I do
I
know
read the
some about
introduction.
that, even though I didn't read the introduction because I've seen her on people's
Okay,
channels.
so let's back up. Go back
Carrie,
and
do you want to this would be a good opportunity for you to get some mic time, Carrie.
Well,
Do you want to do it or you
so, well, basically what happened was she was a reporter and she started doing, food reviews, and she would like go to restaurants and rate the food and stuff. And so she started eating all of this rich, so-called bad for you food, and she realized that she felt better and she was looking a lot better, and because she has an inquisitive mind, she was thinking, well, why is this? Why am I losing weight when I'm eating stuff that should make me heavier, make me gain weight even more?
yeah.
And it's pleasurable food, it's delicious, and yet it's what we're told not to eat. And so then she started just looking into it, and she opened up a big can of worms.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
In
she
her
said what?
inquisitive mind, she's it's funny. She's kind of comparable to you in a way, Carrie. The way that it reminds me of how when you first started, like you were talking about how you just got all that meat and you didn't really even intend to go carnivore, but then you kind of realized that it was making you feel better. I
Mhm.
mean, it's your story. Don't let me tell it wrong,
No, look, yeah, you're doing it. You got it.
but it's kind of like I mean, the proof's in the pudding, so to speak.
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah.
you eat it and then you feel those effects. So
She was
I thought
working
that
for
was
a
really neat
gourmet.
that she's not a doctor, she's not
No,
like
she's a
she doesn't have
journalist.
a dog in this fight. She's a journalist and
Yeah.
sounds like she's doing some true unbiased journalism here.
Yeah,
And isn't it
she was
funny
working for
how
Gourmet Magazine at the time.
mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's funny how the journalists or the true journalists, I mean, there are some people that they say they're journalists and they're really not. But
Right.
I mean, people like Gary Taubes, for example, I mean, he's a journalist too, and he digs in, and likewise she is, and they aren't even in, like, they're not medical doctors, they're not
Yeah.
researchers, they're not any of that, but from an outside perspective, and they can apply logic that they've used with other things, and they're like, wait a minute, this just isn't right, this doesn't sound right, this isn't logical, this
Right.
isn't how science is supposed to be. And it's just, I find it fascinating that the two prominent writers in this space are not even medical people.
Yeah.
Yeah. I had forgotten that he was a journalist.
Yeah. And she said
They
that,
just get to know so much information and it's just
oh,
amazing.
well, yeah. I mean, and she
Mhm.
said that the story that she was asked to write for Gourmet Magazine was about trans fats. And it led to this rabbit hole that she went down, just studying about fat in general. And
Mhm.
yeah, and she went far back into our history, and which is, I think, what a good journalist should do is you got to start with like what's the beginning of the story,
Yeah,
and
and
when
she
did things
talked to
start to
some
change.
scientists too.
Mhm. She went back
And
and interviewed people who were involved in the studies.
yeah, and
Yes.
she was surprised at like the just zealotry basically that went on. She said, while good science should be ruled by skepticism and self doubt, the field of nutrition has instead been shaped by passions verging on zealotry.
Right.
And, maybe that's because of the poor foundations that it was built on to begin with.
Well, I think that a lot of these researchers that do nutrition research, they have to invest decades of their lives because you cannot have a very good short-term nutritional study.
Yeah.
You have to look at this. So it's like a lifelong pursuit. I think the further they get invested into it, the less flexible they are. And hi, Susan, the less flexible they are in being open to the fact that maybe they have just like wasted their whole life pursuing an idea that turns out to be wrong. I mean, I can imagine that must be
Yeah.
very difficult.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And
And
like it does become, I mean, it's human nature to be like tribal,
Yeah.
back in, back in the old age, old ages, we would not have survived if we weren't tribal people,
Right.
So if somebody acted different from you or they didn't fit the mold of the group, you had to, correct them or, keep them in line. Well, we don't have to do that now, it's a different time, but we still have that old,
The same mentality.
yeah, it's like a innate instinct,
Yeah.
And it's a
Chris
thing
said
about
no.
admitting that you're wrong, or that because to admit you're wrong, there are people who think that if they do that, and I mean it seems prevalent in the nutrition space, that if somebody admits that they're wrong about something, that somehow that takes away from everything that's been done before. Whereas like in other sciences, you test a hypothesis and you actually try to disprove your hypothesis, and then you
Right.
just keep moving forward with it, and you don't have paradoxes and outliers. I mean, like, as you know,
Well,
going through
yeah.
this,
And science is
looking
supposed
at,
to be guilty until proven innocent. You're supposed to assume you're wrong and then
yep,
until you're proven correct. And that's the way scientific research is supposed to be.
yeah. And what's funny is it's opposite in nutrition science, and people just don't admit that they're wrong. And then if somebody does try to either say something is wrong, prove something is wrong, or admit something is wrong, they are just totally ostracized. I mean, they have got to walk the party line or they're out.
Oh, yeah. It could be
Yeah.
career ending.
Yeah.
And I think part of the problem is that they, with nutritional research, you never really get past the hypothesis state because you can't, because you would have to keep people, as we've said before, you would have to keep people hostage and watch every morsel that went into their mouth. And it just, there are just so many variables there, that you can't really do a good
Right.
study, and you have to rely on these food questionnaires, food frequency questionnaires that we all know are not, I mean, they can't be accurate.
No.
You can develop a hypothesis with that, but you're not going to get a true, scientific result. Chris said nobody hardly knew what heart attacks or circulatory issues were till the introduction of crappy, cheap vegetable oils. So yeah, I'd say that could have definitely played a big factor.
You think that somebody would have seen the connection, but they did not.
Well, I
Or they
mean, and
ignored it.
maybe they did. It's like
Yeah, they ignored it.
in chapter 3, they kind of showed where there were many men who were like, wait a minute, guys, we're not really this is not really solid, and they were just, like you said, their careers were basically, they attempted to end them.
Yeah.
I've seen footage from the McGovern hearings. I'm sure, they're like, for example, Tom.
Have you?
Yeah, Tom Naughton has some of it in, the Fathead video, but then there's other like snippets on YouTube and stuff where other people have also gotten that footage and talked about it. And I mean, they were arguing about it. I mean, like they were sitting at this big conference table and just basically, I mean, there was very heated discussion. And what's funny is I've got a book, and I think I've told you all about this book before, and I know I've done a couple of videos referencing it, but it's called The Body, and it came out in 1968, I believe is the year. And in that book, I mean, it was by no means settled. They actually presented the argument both for for fat saturated fat causing heart disease, but then also talked about the argument about sugar and sweets causing it. And so it was basically an almost even Steven kind of presentation of the data then. And so it's interesting because when people say that the science is settled or whatever, it isn't, and it wasn't. It's just what we were told and what was presented to us as fact.
It's that consensus that they're trying to show, that we all agree, all the scientists agree, and so therefore the science is settled, but that's really not the case.
Yeah, they did not agree.
Yeah. So.
I would like to watch that. That would be really interesting.
Yeah, if you haven't watched Fathead, it came out in like the mid 2000s.
You know what? I have, but it's been so.
I haven't seen it.
I think I have. Maybe I haven't. I don't know. There's been. I think I'm thinking of that one, Super Size Me or something.
Oh yeah.
Well, he put Fathead out to counteract or to oppose or to like argue against Super Size Me. Like the information that guy had presented was not complete, like his food logs and all this kind of stuff. I mean, you would just have to watch Fathead to get the full
well, I have to
gist
watch
of it. But he basically had started that because the whole premise of Super Size Me, when you looked at what he supposedly ate versus the results and all of this kind of thing, he was like, wait a minute, this just isn't logical. This isn't possible. Yeah. And of course, Tom Naughton, he was like one of the first ones I ever discovered when I was on my low carb or my quest to avoid diabetes. And he was one of the first ones I discovered back then. And so his documentary, that Fathead, was one of the first ones I'd watched. But that's how I found out about Ansel Keys and the whole, the padding of the data and conveniently leaving some out.
Yeah. So she talks about in chapter 1 about some of the people who actually were finding a lot of the information that supports you could be very healthy with a very high fat animal-based diet. So this guy Stephenson that went to live with the Inuits was one. One thing I learned from this, which I thought was super interesting, was that the people, they ate a lot of fat, they ate organs, but he said the leaner parts were fed to the dogs.
Mm-hmm.
Huh.
And they'd eat like the fatty cuts of the meat, and they'd eat the actual fat. They'd eat like all the organs. So it's like, I don't like the lean cuts of beef. I just don't. And I just find I'm not that interested in them. And we buy, from a local rancher, so we get all the cuts, as part of the cow that we get. But I definitely don't like it. But I didn't really, it was interesting that even way back then, they intuitively knew that those lean cuts were not as good for us. Now, dogs can't eat the high fat.
Yeah.
They don't
That's
have
what I was thinking. Maybe they knew that,
Yeah. They don't have the same enzymes to digest the fat that we do.
I thought it was interesting. He said the chief occasion for vegetables with most Eskimos was famine.
Yes.
Yep.
He said he wrote that in his book, Not by Bread Alone, which now I want to read that. But he said, if meat needs carbohydrate and other vegetable additives to make it wholesome, then the poor Eskimos were not eating healthfully.
And they were very healthy. I thought it was interesting.
Yeah.
He said during the year that he was with them, he only got sick one time, and it was when his other experimenters encouraged him to eat only lean meat without fat.
Yeah, and he said he witnessed neither obesity nor disease.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So they were eating very, very high fat and basically no vegetables and no fruit, and they were very, very healthy. And then he talks about also George Mann, who went to Africa to study the Maasai. I was interested because I didn't realize how much milk they drank.
And you
How
know
much
what
did it
tied that
say?
in for me? How many of you all watched Survivor, like in the beginning, like when Survivor first came out? And like
I never
maybe
did.
the second year, I haven't watched it in forever. I don't even know if it still airs or not. But back in the very beginning, it was just so unique. But they were in Africa and they were with, I'm almost positive it was the Maasai, but they took these tubes and they would slit in the cow, like in their neck, like there would be like a vein there, and they would just make a little slit and put the tube there and drain the blood out, and they would mix the blood in with the milk.
Yeah, he mentions she mentions that in this
And when
book.
this was describing the Maasai and how much milk they drank, I'm like,
Yeah.
it just brought that Survivor.
Oh, they did that on
episode.
Survivor too. Well, she mentions that they would drink the warriors would drink 3 to 5 liters of milk
Hey, Dar.
every day. And when milk was in, like when they were running low, they would mix it with the blood
Mm-hmm.
to bring the volume of it up. And then they would eat let's see, on their market days when they get the fresh meat, they would eat 4 to 10 pounds of fatty beef per person, which is insane. That's like a very large amount of food. But I guess they were the warriors. But they didn't eat any vegetables at all. And so one of the things he learned from his study of the Maasai is that things like gaining weight, having blood pressure issues is not correlated with age. So we tend to assume that we're all going to develop these issues with age, but he says with the Maasai, that did not happen. That their older people were just as fit and their blood pressure was just as low and healthy as the younger people. So that was one of the big takeaways for him, is that these age related issues really were not age related.
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing how much, like, it never ceases to amaze me. Every day I'm just blown away. I don't know at what point I won't be blown away anymore, but it never ceases to amaze me, like how obvious so much of this stuff is if you were to just sit and think about it as a rational human being,
Yeah.
It just, a lot of it just seems so incredibly obvious. And like, if you go with your instinct and stuff like that, how you talk about, kids and babies, they're not begging for vegetables. Dogs, you should see my dogs when I'm cooking broccoli. They're nowhere to be found.
Oh yeah.
Right. Exactly.
But now that I'm on my current diet, I mean, I bring home to my coworker sells me eggs, fresh, eggs from her chickens. And I bring home about 2 dozen of them every week if I can.
Oh,
And I'll walk through the door. My dog knows I've got those eggs.
Oh yeah, dogs love it.
I mean, and she wants to just get one. She'll take it in her mouth. She'll just get it. She'll drop it on the floor, and then she'll eat it, and she'll eat the shell and everything.
Oh yeah, well,
I'm like,
eggshells, grinding up eggshells is good for dogs as a source of calcium.
Yeah, I mean, I go back and forth about, yeah, exactly. I saved some, but I go back and forth about like, oh, should I be letting her eat that? But I mean, if she was in the wild, she'd just go find her a, nest of, or a nest. She'd go find the chicken, where the chickens have been roosting, and she would get her one,
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So yeah, so I thought that was really interesting that they're studying all of these, people who eat these diets and finding them to be very healthy, but nobody was interested in hearing what they had to say. Hi, Simpson.
Yeah.
Let's see.
It's like, just be quiet. Just nope, that's not the way we think. Doesn't go along with the narrative.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. And so then they studied too the Native Americans in the Southwest.
Mm-hmm.
This other anthropologist whose name is even harder to say.
Go for it.
Alice Herdlicka?
Alessandro, let's see, I've got that one. Let me see. I think I've got it phonetically.
It's missing a vowel, but it's Herdlicka or something like that, or Herdlicka.
Yeah.
He was a doctor who turned into an anthropologist in the late 1800s, early 1900s. He was observing the Native Americans, and he's the one who noticed that they have a ton of people, way more than the U.S. average, that live to be over 100.
Yes. And
Mm-hmm.
I had heard Dr. Berry like allude to that, but then seeing that in here and tying it in with the with the researcher who I was just like, wow. So this isn't some like carnivore or keto rumors or whatever. I mean, these were actual researchers that
Right.
found this, and it's documented.
Exactly.
Not an
He said,
exaggeration.
yeah,
It's
he wrote up a
actual.
460-page report for the Smithsonian Institute, and this was included in his report. So, like, there was dramatically more centenarians in this population, but he said not one of them was demented or helpless.
Hmm.
So they weren't just over 100 and dependent on people to take care of them. It sounds like they were very functional and their brains were in good condition. So they didn't have the chronic disease. It really, it's interesting because I remember, even back in nursing school and learning all about illnesses, and we talk about aging. I remember them teaching us that we should be suspect of a sudden change. Even if it's an old person, don't attribute it to age. If it's a sudden decline, there's obviously something going
Yeah.
on.
Mm-hmm.
But it was never taught that the gradual decline was something to be alerted about.
And the
It was
amount
not-
of things that we think are related to age just because they seem to happen with every person that is in our
Right.
society that gets older. It's, I
Right.
mean, I missed so many questions on that in nursing school because it's, because of what we see versus what is actually the real truth,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
It's
it
like
was
the
always
timetable is pretty consistent because for the most part we eat garbage. I mean, we just eat what we're told.
Right.
Even if we think we're doing the right thing, it's still not conducive to good health, and so it's still low fat and it's still a lot of fiber and all of that. And so when it looks like that, oh well, this is what happens when you age because the vast majority of people are eating that way, and so they're getting the disease or the illness or whatever, the progression at pretty much the same rate. So it just looks like it's just typical of everybody, when really if we weren't eating the way we do, when I say we, I mean, the Western world.
Yeah.
It's really, and I used to just think, I'm sure you guys did too, that, it's just a part of getting old. And I mean, you hear people like around you make those statements too.
Yeah.
Like to be, oh yeah, I must be getting old, that
And they still do. They still do.
Mhm.
People my age do.
Yeah.
And I'm like, hello, first of all, I'm not old. I don't know who you're
Right.
talking about. You can go somewhere else with that. Okay.
Yeah.
But secondly, like, no, that's not like, I don't hurt. I have no pains in my joints anymore. Every time I used to stand up out of that chair at work, I would be like grabbing my lower back. Oh, and it would take me, I mean, it felt like a good minute just to get straightened out and like actually moving. And now I just hop up, hop down. I'm dropping down, squatting. I squat, I've always squatted at the bedside to empty Foley catheters and things like that. But now I just do it just for fun around here because I can.
That's awesome.
I mean, as
remember
long
waking
as
up
I
in the
can,
morning.
I want to be able to.
I was in
Yeah.
pain when I'd wake up in the morning before. I mean, I felt
Me
like I
too.
was, I mean, just my feet, I'd wake up and my feet were killing me. My whole body was aching from head to toe. I was walking around like I was 90 years old.
Yeah.
So Simpson's doing a rebounder challenge with me this month.
Awesome. I
So
want to get
she's
me a
doing-
new one. I've got that little bitty trampoline, but I want a legit one with the bar and
Oh, I need the bar. I absolutely need the bar. So So expectations for gradual
I could
decline
do a
is-
lot more with the bar because it's such a small area that even though I feel confident jumping on it, I have to kind of watch my feet, and that's no fun.
Yeah.
Darth Carnivore said expectations for gradual decline associated with aging is based on feeding people an improper human diet. You're exactly right.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I assume Susan is talking about before she started eating this way, she could hardly put one foot in front of the other. One of my worst symptoms was I would get out of the bed in the morning and I could feel it even before my feet hit the floor, but especially when they hit the floor, the bottom of my feet would hurt so bad. It would remind me of, like if you've been shopping all day and your feet are just aching so bad on the bottom. That's how they felt the moment I hit the ground.
Oh
And
yeah, me too.
I knew that wasn't normal,
No,
I don't
that's
care how old you
absolutely
are.
not normal. Yeah. Yeah. So, all right. So I know you talked a little bit about like raised, like wild caught meat versus, ranch, like raised cows, and how it was supposedly thought that that wild cut meat was healthier, but it kind of sounds like that was not really the case.
No, because they didn't report when they did that study that there was actually no difference in the saturated fat content.
Right.
So while there was more polyunsaturated fat in the food or in the different meats, versus like the Uganda, I think it was the Ugandan Game Department.
Yeah.
It was Crawford, 1968. Yeah. And so he reported that about the polyunsaturated fat, there being more of it in traditional Western sources of the food versus in Uganda. But he didn't
It was the
tell
other way
anybody.
around, though.
Yeah.
It was the opposite. It was the other way around. He said
What
that
page are you
the
guys on? I'm sorry.
16, the meat.
No,
the
they
meat
had more polyunsaturated fat, but then there was no difference in the
No
saturated
difference in the saturated fat.
Yeah.
It said the meat of the wild animals contained 10 times more polyunsaturated fat than did the flesh of the domesticated ones. So there was no difference in the saturated. And they were like attacking saturated fats.
Exactly. Yeah. And he didn't say that part. He just said that the wild game was healthier because it had more of the polyunsaturated fat, but he didn't tell people or didn't release in his study that there was no difference in saturated fat, which was supposed to be what was harming
That
everybody.
was supposed to be the harm, right? And there was no
Yeah.
difference whatsoever, yes, between the two.
Yeah.
Yeah. So so it sounds like there's more than one culture too that fed the lean cuts to the dogs.
Yeah, that I think even back as far as Lewis and Clark, they had reported during their travels in 1805 that there was a lot of disappointment because the game that they had hunted, the 40 deer, 3 buffalo, and 16 elk that they brought back on a haul were too lean for use.
Yeah.
And that meant plenty of muscle meat, but not enough fat.
Not enough of the fat. Yeah. Which is just interesting because so much of what's considered a healthy diet now, they emphasize lean meat. And and then the one guy who actually got sick when he did the lean meat and went away from the fat. It's like, well, no wonder we're all sick. Everyone's focused on the lean meat.
So, question for you guys, because we're all kind of like-minded in here, I feel like. So I go back and forth as far as like, do I just eat my meat 1-to-1, try to get the meat with the natural fat that it comes with it? Or do I add butter to everything? I've really gone back and forth, and it seems like every other thing I listen to or read tells me completely the opposite. One will say, oh, yes, you need to add more fat. And then the other will say, no, you want to eat the fat off your body, so don't add a bunch of fat. And so that's been really confusing. What do you guys think?
Now, Carrie and I are on opposite ends because, you're very lean and wanting to make sure you have some extra, weight on you, grow weight. I'm shrinking. I'm the opposite. But I've gone back and forth too, and I've stuck with just the really fatty cuts of meat without adding the
And
extra fat.
I think the whole premise of, okay, the fat's the energy or the sugar's the energy. So I'm not eating sugar, so I need something for energy and, immediate, and that's going to
Yeah.
be the fat, right? So, but if I'm not eating the fat,
But I think
that's
that if
where
we're
my
looking at if
modest
we
level of biochemistry is
like
not.
weight loss is one thing, right? But if we're looking at metabolic health, the higher fat is better.
I mean, I'm looking at weight loss.
Yeah. I mean, from a
you
weight loss
know, um,
perspective, if you have fat to live off of, I mean,
I
theoretically,
definitely do.
I would think that if you're burning your own fat, you're still helping yourself metabolically.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
agree. I
So
mean, the leaner I get, I think the more metabolically healthy I'm going to be. So it's kind of
yeah.
like, but I'm not losing weight the way that the way that I should be in my mind, you know. And I've tried several different things. And then I had convinced myself there for a while that, oh, the magical vegetables must be needed. And so I tried to like add a few back, like, and then I'm just like, no, I just don't feel like that's the right answer for me
Well, a
right
lot of
now
people
anyway.
do like what they do on Steak and Butter Gang, which is to do the priming and to eat a lot, and then
I feel
they'll
like I've
help
been
break
priming for 11
but
months now.
they'll help break a stall, you know.
Maybe
So
I'm just
you
eating too
all
much.
primed
I don't
up.
know.
You're primed.
Well, I don't know if I'm eating way too much or not enough. Maybe I just
I
need to actually track,
track.
As much as I despise tracking, I hate it.
Well, maybe do it for
You
a
know
week.
what might be helpful though, because I've heard Dr. Berry say things to this effect before, like don't think so much in terms of like, oh, I have to add this much fat or I have to do that. I mean, obviously you don't eat lean cuts of meat, but you eat them whatever fat comes on the meat, you get intentionally purchase and eat the fatty meat,
Yeah.
but
Oh, I
you
definitely
don't
do that.
necessarily add any more unless you feel like you need it. Like if something within you says that you actually need to add butter,
Yeah.
sort of like he talks about with salt, you salt it to taste. So you would eat the fat that you would. Some people, I mean, I've craved fat before, like, where I just want the fat. And I know that
Yeah.
sounds unusual
Yeah.
to a lot of people, but I have wanted
No, not me.
the
That's what I
fat that's on the
crave.
outside of the steak and stuff.
Oh
I
yeah.
mean,
Well,
I will
when
eat
there's
it.
when there's like a big old thing of fat on the steak, I'll take it and I'll cut it up into little pieces and then
Uh-huh.
I'll eat a bite with the meat,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it makes it so much better to eat the fat with it.
Oh, I mean, I like that's my favorite part. Me and my husband, we joke around that we're Jack Sprat and his wife
Yeah.
because he likes the lean and I'm like, give me all the fat because that's
Oh
where the
yeah.
flavor's at.
The lean is
Yes,
right.
that is where the
Yeah.
flavor is.
So maybe substitute lard or tallow for butter. So possibly.
Well, now
I
that's a
bought some
thought.
lard. I don't know.
Well, do you make like the little fat crisps? Get just the fat trimmings from the butcher and
I
make.
I I got some. I have a whole bunch of them out in my freezer, but I haven't actually, made them. I just
I
froze
haven't
them.
either.
They're
I've got some too, and
good.
I still
There's
haven't.
so many things to do, y'all, and there's only so much time in the day.
Yes, that's true. So, all right. Was there anything else from chapter 1?
Brisket's my
Okay.
favorite, by the way, Simpson.
I love brisket.
No, I think we can move on to chapter 2.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So chapter 2 is a lot about Ansel Keys.
Yes. Oh, the great, most popular Ansel Keys. He's probably the most hated man in nutrition.
Well, at least from those of us who are not into being vegetarian.
Yeah.
But yeah, she goes into a lot of his background.
Hey, while you're going over this, I need to go to the restroom real quick. I'll be right back.
Okay. All right, let's see. So I don't know, boy, I tell you, he started off researching heart disease, right? Carrie, correct me if I'm wrong here. So
Yeah, and of course it goes back even before that, like with Jeremiah Stamler, who said that cholesterol is biological rust, which was the birth of the whole
right.
cholesterol clogging your arteries kind of thing.
Yeah.
And to this day, the cholesterol slash saturated fat artery clogging visual is still there, but that's where that started. And so like they were also operating under the presumption that because there were these sick children, they had a well crap, I just went blank, but it was a genetic illness that they produced the xanthomas, and they were relating the fact that the xanthomas were the same, like operated in the same way
Yeah, which
as
are little like cholesterol deposits on the
yeah.
skin, and it can happen like the
Mhm,
palms, the eyes. Yeah, so they were making correlation to what goes on inside,
mhm.
you
They were
know.
relating it, and which it sort of seems logical in a sense, but then they were also, of course, there were discussions even then about perhaps it's not the cholesterol, it is the way that their genetic condition processes.
Right, that they had a genetic issue.
Mhm.
Yeah, that it was the way they processed these little children who ended up with these
Yeah.
heart disease. But
Mhm.
Keyes is he developed the hypothesis that saturated fat causes heart disease.
Oh, and
And
then what helped it even further along was in 1913, you had, gosh, I don't know, Nikolai and Anishau. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but this guy fed rabbits large amounts of cholesterol. And of course, what did it do? But rabbits are herbivores,
they're herbivores, right? So you feed them a wrong diet, and then they
but they
publish the
took that as
findings.
proof. Yeah,
Right,
he operated like, see, this is what you get. And it's like,
right.
no, that's not really that logical, but a lot of people bought into it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I mean, it makes me wonder too, because this is like you said back in 1913, and they found that they could actually make these rabbit develop these atherosclerotic type lesions by feeding them huge amounts of cholesterol. You would think that like even back then they weren't going like, hey, well maybe we should choose an animal that has a diet very similar to people. They
Well, they
choose,
did
like
do
you
it with
said, an
dogs,
herbivore.
and they did get a different result with dogs, but for some reason they kind of
Yes.
just ignored that.
Yes, they did the experiment again. It was replicated on dogs, which eat meat like we do. The animals demonstrated an ability to regulate and excrete the extra cholesterol. So the
Mhm.
canine comparison seemed like a better model for humans, yet the original rabbit experiment had already riveted heart disease researchers,
Yeah.
and cholesterol fixed itself as the principal subject of the development of heart disease. So they basically got stuck on this article about the rabbits, the study about the rabbits, and they ran with it
Yep.
and figured out that, well, it's got to be the cholesterol. But then, like you said, later that the cholesterol thing was kind of debunked. But then they switched their focus to the saturated fat.
Yep.
Um, and for a while eggs got a bad rap, but then eggs kind of they were that when they got away from the cholesterol issue, they backed off on eggs. Um, and didn't put any like upper limit to how many eggs we can eat. But it did show I guess there's a process of homeostasis that the body develop, and this is the case with so much. I mean, so many of our electrolytes, our kidneys will regulate and keep our electrolytes in homeostasis. The glands and stuff will regulate things, but there's a homeostasis when it comes to cholesterol levels as well. And
Mhm.
I know we read before, and was it the obesity code that we read, that the body makes like 80% of our cholesterol we make ourselves?
Yeah.
And so they found that the more they fed cholesterol, just our body would just naturally regulate, and we'd maybe not produce as much ourselves. So there was that natural homeostasis that we achieve in our bodies.
And that makes sense because we do the same thing with sugar, you
Yeah.
know, and a lot of other things, but like sugar for sure. If you don't make enough, I mean, if you don't eat sugar, your body is able to produce as much as it needs, which is not a lot.
Yeah.
But
When on the carnivore diet, our body can still produce glucose as needed without us needing to eat any carbohydrates at all. Our liver will produce if certain parts of the body need more glucose than others, so our body will just produce it itself.
And likewise, if you have too much glucose, your body also is designed to get rid of it because it wants to preserve that homeostasis in with, what is it, the 2 teaspoons of sugar. I think that's all that is supposed to be, in your whole body at any given time. And so that's why your insulin will just like jack up to ridiculous until it just burns, until you're, eventually you can't do it anymore. But I mean, because you have to be in that strict window, in that narrow frame.
Yeah.
Otherwise it could be deadly.
Yeah. But on page 26, this is how it transitioned from the cholesterol to the fats. There was this Institute of Metabolic Research in Oakland. It says that in 1952, the researchers first discovered that replacing animal fats with vegetable fats would dramatically lower total cholesterol. And then the team at Harvard University found that the serum cholesterol levels of vegetarians were lower in those who ate no dairy products compared to those who ate eggs and milk. So they were still, even though they kind of let go of the cholesterol thing, they were still looking at cholesterol and heart disease. But they were saying that that looking at the influence of animal fats versus vegetable fats on cholesterol, and seeing that, well, vegetable fats will actually lower your cholesterol. And so therefore they were still making that leap that's going to decrease your risk of heart disease or mortality from heart disease. And so they're still kind of on that same path with linking the fats and the heart disease. And then there was that guy Aarons.
Yeah.
So
trying to read my own handwriting. My handwriting is terrible, but yeah, in the 1950s, he used that gas liquid chromatography to experiment with the fats. And then that's when she got into the whole single and double bonded and all of that about the.
But he found, since he developed these advanced techniques, he found that the cholesterol didn't really go up or down very consistently in response to the different dietary fats. And so he kind of debunked their original research by showing there really isn't consistency with, making the cholesterol go up and down. But he was one that they didn't really listen to either.
Nope.
Because he became like, he was the one that had all the influence, and he developed all that influence over the years. It sounds like he was also very aggressive from what she describes. Like really like an attack would kind of come out and attack.
Oh, he would. And like,
disagreed with him.
Yeah. Let's see, like good grief. Urushkali, I can't pronounce. Urushkali and Hillebo were they were two, let's see. Okay. My notes are just terrible. But they basically what they did was they criticized the studies because there was discrepancies that Ansel Keys had in terms of across various countries. No, I'll take that back. They contradicted the findings in his study by all of the data points. Like he had only picked a few countries that showed, and they put it together. They plotted it to where it included all countries, and it was just a big scattering all over, so there was no rhyme or reason to it.
Right,
And then
right.
when Ansel Keys went after that, because it looked like they had a slam dunk when they were showing that the work was not, it wasn't accurate. I mean, there were
Well,
things
he
that
was
were not
picking and
factored in, and
choosing.
so, but then he turned around. Ansel Keys turned around and criticized them, even though he had done the same. He used the same data, but he was saying, "Well, it's not consistent because the Americans diagnosed heart disease 30% more than." And so you couldn't have a consistency in what the cause of death was and all of this. But then he turned around though and used the same data
Use the
anyway.
same
So it's
data.
like,
Yeah. And he picked and chooses which data which countries he was going to present, because he wanted to show a nice straight upward line between the consumption of fat and heart disease. So he picked all these countries that supported his hypothesis and ignored all of these other countries that didn't. And then went and criticized the data that these other guys used. But yeah, it's interesting. So when they said that in 1964, they found that American doctors, when they were presented with exactly the same health records as European doctors, diagnosed heart disease 33% more often than the British doctors and 50% more often than Norwegian doctors. That was shocking to me. Like, they actually gave them this exact same patient files and looked at the exact same data on these patients, and their diagnosis was that much of heart disease. That makes me wonder if that's still happening.
I think it is. I think it happens because they're just, I just think that's been such a focus that, and they probably look at things like cholesterol levels and stuff like that, which, you know what I'm saying? So they use these markers now. I mean, even like when a doctor looks at your labs and then they want to prescribe a statin because of your cholesterol, but you might not even have heart disease. So you wouldn't even know unless you had a CAT scan, for example, or other
it makes me
scans.
wonder if they were,
So
if
I'm
they had
thinking
high cholesterol, if they called it heart disease.
Yep. That's what I'm thinking.
Interesting. That might
It's
be
just a thought that I have. I don't know that it's accurate.
Well, because she didn't elaborate on the why.
Right.
And that would be really interesting to know, is why were they, what criterion were they using to determine that someone had heart disease? Obviously it was different.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, were they including people who they considered had risk factors?
Exactly.
I don't know, but that alone makes the data completely unreliable. Because if you're comparing countries and you have one country that doctors totally overdiagnose heart disease,
Mm-hmm.
and of course, according to Ansel Keys' graph, the U.S. had the worst heart disease and for fat consumption, but yet we have all these doctors overdiagnosing.
Exactly.
When it comes to heart disease, also, let's say, okay, a lot of us have had a feeling in our chest from time to time, especially by the time we get to age 40 or 50, right? Some of us may have been to the ER for it.
Yeah.
Though a portion of those people may have had heart catheterizations. Okay. I know there is some, research out there, because I've read about it, that says that, a lot of the blockages that they would find may not be interpreted, may not be found. Say, this sounds conspiratorial, but it's really not. So let's say that, Lynn, you and I both have a blockage in our heart that's 50%. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So it's significant, but it's not like cutting off all blood flow, right?
Yeah.
And let's say that I go for a heart cath and you don't. Okay. You might just be going along just fine, not having a single problem in the world. But maybe because I had, I might have even had some GERD that caused a little chest pain.
Right.
And I went there. Now I have some stents in that 50 or 60% blockage, whatever, that particular doctor's line is.
Yeah, it has to be enough.
You see
to
what I'm
where the
saying?
stent
Like,
will stay in place.
because I've had some pretty bad pains before that were actually my esophagus causing me pains, but it sure felt like I was having a heart attack.
There's a ton of chest
and I'm
of
not
course,
saying there aren't ways of diagnosing, like, we're not talking heart attacks. We're talking just like
chest pain.
blockages. Okay.
Like how you present.
Yeah.
Well, if you go into the ER and you're complaining of chest pain, I mean, there's so many different things that can cause chest pain.
Yeah.
But
And I used to be a post heart cath nurse. So I saw a lot of cases that I thought, like, what did they just do that while they were in there? Or, you know what I'm saying? It was kind of like, I don't know. I mean, most of them were like, it sounds weird I don't want to imply that like it wasn't legit, that's not what I'm trying to imply at all. I'm just
but did it
saying
cause their symptoms?
exactly.
Right.
And
Because
and
if you
so
have
and
like
the
a
reason
60%
why
blockage, it may not cause you any symptoms.
So the reason why I say this is because sometimes they would get in there and there would be absolutely nothing that they saw relevant enough to stent. And then that same person a month later would be back with a heart attack. And then they would and so it's like, how did that happen? I don't know. There was a little bit of, there were a few cases here and there that were like that. They were just like, what? And I don't know if that just means human error or it means, so one factor here is that whenever we get blockages in our heart, if it's over a long enough period of time, we develop what we call collateral flow. Okay.
Right.
So that means that your body actually says, ooh, I'm not getting enough, blood circulation to this area of my heart. And it starts sprouting these little veins, these little vessels. And it says, here, have this blood flow. It's a way that my dad ended up with what they were calling 97 and 99% blockages. And one of them was in his widowmaker, by the way. But he barely even had chest pain.
Yeah.
So,
well, that happens all the time with cirrhosis. People, they get that portal hypertension and they develop esophageal varices where it's the collateral veins that develop. Your body just does that. It's this whole thing about your body compensating, right? When there's a challenge to the blood flow in a main vessel, you'll develop these collateral vessels, but they're weak. They're not strong like the original vessels. And I know that
but they keep some people alive for a while. Cause
they do.
Between that and my dad drinking alcohol, I was firmly convinced that those two things kept him from having a massive MI because he never even had a heart attack.
Interesting.
So,
yeah.
Anyway,
So
he ended up with a big cabbage and he definitely had heart disease. I'm not saying that, I'm not ridiculous. It's just interesting,
Yeah.
I love it when you guys get to talking about this stuff. I learned so much just from listening to y'all.
Well, you just see so much. And sometimes, honestly, you just see things that you cannot explain and the doctors can't explain.
Yeah. And there's a lot of chest pain that turns out to be a GI
Oh,
related.
yeah, a lot. I used to work in the ER.
Costochondritis.
Uh-huh.
I mean, costochondritis can cause a lot of pain. And so, abdominal wall pain can cause a lot of issues. It can go up into your chest and there's musculoskeletal things, there's all sorts of stuff.
When I get like an esophageal, like a gastritis, esophagitis type of thing, it'll actually hurt right here. I'm going to show you guys on me. It'll hurt like right here. And my heart is right in here. And it feels very much like, oh gosh, this could be my heart. And sometimes I'll even get such bad heartburn. Like if I used to drink alcohol on an empty stomach, I would get such severe heartburn that I would have to leave the restaurant that we were at and go find a gas station and get some Tums. And I don't know why I never learned to eat some bread first before you drink that alcohol.
Yeah. Awesome. So we have an interesting comment from Darth Carnivore about the.
Okay, let's see here. Teicholz in her footnotes describes heart disease as an umbrella term, but clarifies that researchers during this time were primarily concerned with atherosclerosis, plaque buildup in the arteries. And that's what I would define as heart disease. That's normally what the medical system refers to as heart disease. Is the actual
In the
the
time,
They wouldn't
plaques,
really
you know.
back then. I mean, they wouldn't really know if somebody had atherosclerosis back then, unless the person died and they autopsied them, right? I mean, did
Well,
they have any way of? They didn't have imaging that was like the imaging we have
when
today,
did
where
they start
you can
having
see.
cath labs?
Oh, that was, I mean,
Would they? I mean, how was the technology back then, like in the 50s?
I would think
to be
like
able to,
the 70s or 80s, but I don't know.
Yeah, I
I
mean, I
can't
don't even know.
remember.
Did they even do
Let's see here.
echocardiograms and?
Okay, let's see. First heart catheterization. Let's see. Geez, I was way off. 1929.
really?
Oh,
Yeah, the
wow,
first right heart catheterization in a human was performed by. Oh, it was that guy that did it on himself. I remember hearing this now.
Okay.
Werner Forssmann on himself in 1929. Diagnostic heart catheterization was introduced by Andre Cornin and Dixon Richardson in the early 1940s, and selective coronary angiography was described by Mason Sones in the early 1960s. So it sounds like it probably really got going good in the 60s.
But so like, for example, I just looked up echocardiograph. It's been around for a while, but it didn't become established clinical practice until like the 70s.
Yeah. And that's kind of how things are, you see your first one in the what'd that say, in the 20s, and then everybody kind of thinks it's crazy for a while, and it's just fringe science, and then it takes so long to like make things standard.
With that said, back when this was,
and so much has changed, by the way, in 24 years since I first started, and I was a post-heart cath nurse. Yeah. I mean, they used to have to go into the groin every single time. Now they're going into the brachial artery, and they're going into the radial artery, and it's just amazing because you come out of your heart cath and you have this little band. We call it of course now I can't remember.
Yeah,
band.
I've seen
transradial.
Yeah,
it's just like it holds pressure, and we used to have to pull the sheaths. We used to have to pull the sheaths out of your leg and sit there and hold pressure in your groin. And I mean, it felt like,
I've done that many times.
Falling asleep.
And they had to lay there for like 8 hours without bending at all at the groin. Yeah. And it was miserable for them. And we had to go every hour and check and make sure there wasn't any hematomas.
Oh, every 15 minutes for the first for the first hour.
First period. Yeah.
Yeah. And every 30, and then yeah.
Yeah. So no, there's definitely things that gotten easier. But back when they actually this was 1964 when they did this survey about the doctors overprescribing. So who knows what their criterion was, because this was before things like the, catheterization and echocardiograms became standard practice and, clinical practice. So,
so that's why I was just kind of curious as to what they were using to say that this is what they had. Like what kind of imaging, or I had no clue what technology they had at that time.
Oh my gosh. Even now, I know my husband's originally from British Columbia, Canada, and his folks still live up there. Their hospital didn't even have a CT scan.
Oh, wow.
And this is a hospital. And I heard that there was only something like 10 CT scans in the whole province.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. And to get an MRI, like my mother-in-law needed to get an MRI. Well, she needed to get a CT scan. I think they were concerned she might be having a stroke. The local hospital couldn't do anything. So they had to drive her down to 45 minutes away to the hospital in Vancouver to get a CT scan of her head. By then, it's like time is tissue, right? Fortunately, she didn't have a stroke. But then they went to do an MRI, and it was going to be like they had to go to a private clinic, like another 45 minutes the opposite direction. They actually had an MRI machine. So even now in some countries, you wouldn't think that Canada was that third world, but it's kind of crazy. Like we have good diagnostic, diagnostics available here in this country that a lot of these other places don't have even now. So who knows?
That's why a lot of people from Europe, they just come here, and from Canada.
So, Darth Carnivore, this is not a dumb question.
No, it isn't a dumb question.
This is a question that most medical professionals probably don't know the answer to. And honestly, I hadn't really thought that much about it until recently. And it's an arterial thing. Okay. And there's something about like the pressure in the arteries, and I was reading about it, that contributes to the plaque actually forming. So no, it's in the arteries, not in the veins.
But if you use a vein, right? Like if you put a vein where an artery would be, or if it starts to function like an artery, then you do get the plaque buildup there.
But that's interesting because it's contrary to what you would think. Even as an educated medical professional, it's contrary to what you would think. You would think, well, okay, there's not as much pressure in veins. I mean, so it should be easier for it to build up. But that's not the case.
Well, but maybe the pressure creates
now veins can get damaged, of course.
Maybe the pressure is higher chance of creating little micro abrasions that could create scarring and opportunity for something to stick to it potentially.
I wish I could remember where I saw this. I think it was like a podcast or something I was listening to. It may have even been Dr. Who's our carnivore heart surgeon? Ovadia. Yeah. I'm pretty sure it was him that was talking about it, because, you just don't think about it. I don't know. I don't know that they ever told us that, but there's a lot of things they don't tell you. One of the main things, and this took me years to learn because I was almost scared to ask because I just felt stupid for not knowing it. But you know how you have the dysrhythmias, you'll have VTAC, VFib, all that stuff.
Heart block.
For the longest, heart blocks. For the longest time, I was like, okay, that's what this looks like your electrical conduction of your heart. But what does that look like in a person? Like when they say heart attack, do they mean cardiac arrest? Or do they mean block it? I didn't know for the longest time. And I thought it was just, synonymous with
you'll hear
heart attack, and
they'll be used interchangeably, like in the news.
Yeah.
They'll say heart attack.
And that's a big problem.
Yeah, because it's not the same. I mean, because a heart attack is a myocardial infarction where you're lacking blood flow and the tissue gets damaged or dies, whereas a pulmonary, cardiac arrest, your heart just stops.
Yeah. And also something about the news. I just have to share this little gem with you guys. And Lynn, you'll probably know this. But you know how on the news when they say, oh, so-and-so was taken to the hospital where he has been listed as critical but stable condition, or he's been listed in serious condition.
Right.
Somebody just came up with that off the top of their head when they got that phone call. Like, tell him he's critical but stable.
Yeah.
There's nothing on these patients. There's nothing in this medical record that says this patient is stable condition. I mean, obviously, we all know what stable means, and we could define that, and we could say, yes, this patient's definitely stable. But I used to think it meant something. So I would call the hospital when my friends were in car wrecks, and I'd say, what condition are they in? And the nurse would be like, hold on just a second. And now that I know this, I know the nurse was like, what condition should I tell them that they're in? Oh, tell them that they're in the ICU. So let's tell them they're in critical but stable. That sounds good. How about, or just tell them they're in critical. If their blood pressure's all over the place, let's just go with critical. Okay, ma'am, they're in critical condition. They're in the ICU. So just a little snippet there. that I thought was
Yeah.
funny.
Yeah. Terminology. But all right. I think we kind of went on
Yes,
down a
Darth
rabbit hole on
Carnivore.
that one.
That's what that means.
Critical,
Critical but
stable, not
stable,
dead.
not dead, and maybe downgraded. You know?
Well, yeah, I mean, critical but stable could mean that you're not like you don't have the crash cart ready to go.
Yeah, yeah.
You got the pedals right here.
I mean,
But
I
when they're
think that we should use touch and go.
That's right. Things, I
You
mean,
know,
when they're
they're
critical, things
critical and
change
it's
on a
touch and go.
dime. Yeah, things change on a dime if
And
they're
this
critical.
is not really
so-
funny. Sorry, guys. It's
No, it's not. But
the
but
medical
it's supposed
humor.
to
You know?
show, like, and we got talking about this because of the doctors diagnosing people with heart disease, and we're like, how? Like, what were they
Yeah.
doing, and what made it so that they were so much higher in their diagnosis than everybody else? So, all right, but
All
you know, I don't even think we're going to get through chapter 3. We are going like crazy, like not
Oh,
even barely through chapter 2 here.
there's not. I feel like the whole summary of chapter 2's or chapter 2 is just Ansel Keys. We've all heard this story before. If you've read
Yes,
any book, low carb book, you know who Ansel Keys
yes,
was, what he did. He basically was a big bully who basically, you know, got all the
yeah,
guidelines made based on what he said when it was all a bunch of, you know, nonsense. So
it sounds like he
it
developed
was
a
all a
God
bunch of
complex.
cherry picked, you know, data, and he definitely had a God complex. And
Yep.
there you have it. There's chapter 2 for you.
Yeah, pretty much. And they really she brought out a lot of the holes in his data, and the fact that in Greece their subjects were for a period of the study were on Lent, where they naturally weren't
Yep.
eating
Yeah.
the animal foods. They only did close analysis of the diet of 499 of the over 12,000 participants. They
They didn't differentiate between those who fasted and those who didn't.
Nope. Yep. And they used 3 different chemical methods to analyze fats in the food samples, and the results didn't line up. I mean, there's like they shot so many holes in the data
Mm-hmm.
that he collected. And then yeah, and even like with the animal things that were classified as animal foods, they were including margarine, you know, which is not animal based, but it looks like
No.
they said they used it, they lumped it in with animal foods because it looks so much like butter.
Really?
It's like,
Oh,
seriously?
good Lord.
Seriously?
Same.
Not the same. But yeah, so I mean, so many holes were shot through the data from his studies,
Yeah.
but yet he was still considered the foremost expert. But the one thing I wanted to point out on chapter 3, because I know we kind of have to wrap it up, is that he ended up on
You mean chapter 2?
no, I think this is chapter 3, where he ended up on the American Heart Association Nutrition Committee.
Yeah.
Oh, gotcha.
He was not a doctor, but he ended up in a key position along with his Jeremy Stamler, who worked alongside him. They maneuvered themselves onto the nutrition committee of the American Heart Association, where they were able, because prior to them being on this committee, the American Heart Association was kind of cynical about
Yep.
his fat and heart disease work. And then as soon as they got onto this committee, they talked him off that ledge and got him fully committed to the fact that it's fat that causes heart disease. So I thought that was really interesting that he had that influence over our agencies. So
Yeah. And
Yeah.
with Darth Carnivore's question, was there anything
was-
surprising about Ansel Keys in chapter 2? I don't think that there was necessarily anything surprising, except for I was amazed at the depth of how inaccurate the data was. Like, really how poor.
Yes.
We knew it was poor data, but just how
I
poor.
was surprised by the
was.
last sentence of that chapter. In the history of nutrition, Ansel Keys was by far the greatest man.
Well, it's how they defined greatest, right?
Yeah.
A strong personality is how they defined a great man.
Using their own personal charisma, intelligence, wisdom, or wits.
Yeah,
a great
well,
man,
he used
evidently.
he was a bully. One thing that
Mhm.
that surprised me about Ansel Keys, but this was in chapter 3, was
Uh-huh.
how he ate his own personal diet.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Followed
Yeah.
his own advice. He said they had him and his wife
Steaks.
Margaret had they ate dinner at least 3 times a week or so. They had steak, chops, roasts. They were spotted by Kim and Stamler were spotted by colleagues with 5 or so rations of bacon with scrambled eggs. And Keys himself in this Times art said nobody wants to live on mush. So he's a hypocrite.
Mhm.
Well,
And
basically,
he
I
basically
think
said, you know, if they eat that stuff, then they're just at their own risk. You know, that's kind of what I got out of it.
Well, he was
And then
obviously
he
willing
turned
to take
around and ate it himself. I guess he was willing to take the risk.
he was willing to take the risk. Exactly.
And
But
then
yeah, that
either
something,
that or it
surprised
didn't
me.
apply to him, but
yeah,
everybody else, he knew what everybody else should be doing for
he
their
That's
health.
right.
probably just knew he was full of, you know what, to begin
Right.
with.
Oh, yeah.
What got me was though all the like I talked about in the beginning of all the buddy, you know, good old boy network. Oh yeah, you can. We'll look at each other's studies and we'll you know, we'll approve each other's.
And they
Yeah,
referenced each other. So it was just this
yeah, we'll
whole
reference each other.
circular.
Right.
We'll just have this
Right.
big group and where we'll, you know, make sure
Yeah.
that what is the word I'm looking for where they review each other's studies?
The peer review.
Yeah, peer review. Yeah.
Mhm.
We'll peer review each other's studies and, you know, I'll check. It reminds me of some places where I've worked in the past where people just say, oh, will you check me off on this? Okay. Yeah, I'll check you off. Here you
Right.
go.
Right. Right.
I mean, that
Yes.
happens some places. Just
So they would
saying.
not only peer review each other, but they would also reference each other. So like then I would reference your study, Kim, and then you in
Oh, yeah.
turn would reference mine and Lynn's, and then Lynn would reference me. And so we're
Like,
just all just
yeah.
referencing each other and just
then
confirming.
yeah, and everybody eats that way, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, everybody in the whole world is supposed to eat this way. And then I know the guy Aaron's, he's the one who actually found out about triglycerides. So that was mentioned in
Mhm.
chapter
Yeah.
3, where because they originally, the cholesterol and stuff, they didn't have the testing to break it down. And so eventually it was able to be broke down. The lab work advanced as far as the science, and they were able to identify triglycerides. And he actually showed that the blood would cloud up into like a milky white liquid in the test tube. And that with this was the issue with the triglycerides. So that was it's interesting to see how things developed, like the technology developed. And they were able to learn a little bit more, but yet Ansel Keys was still he was still considered the final say.
He was still the man.
He was the man.
Yeah, he was
And
the
Exactly.
if you disagree with that, you're wrong. You know, they were
That's right.
gonna bully you to no end.
Oh yeah,
So you
and
would
even
shut
when
up and you wouldn't even have a job after that. Sound like?
oh yeah, absolutely. You lose your funding, and yeah. So, anyways, let's see.
All right, guys, I can't stay much longer. I've got to take my boys to their music lesson.
All right. So, what do you want to do for next week? Let me look. And
I
see.
think 3. I didn't think 3 was going to be a lot, but I think 3 was actually almost too much because
let's
you know
try
you like to get a
next
little.
time
Yeah,
for
let's do
next week.
2. This is heavy,
It's
Yeah.
heavy, and let's see.
and that way we
Yeah,
can get
we're
off on some
looking-
side conversation. That's the
we're-
fun part too.
And we're looking at
I
over
know, I loved
70,
it.
70 pages for the next 2 chapters. I think that's
Yeah, I think
That's
that's
a lot.
plenty.
so 4 and 5 for next week.
Okay,
4 and
awesome,
5.
guys. Thank you so much for coming. And let me just put our little tags on the screen because I have a new one. I changed mine. It's now Carnivore Nurse Kim. I finally bit the bullet, gave in, and said, you know what? it's for now. I'm carnivore for now. I'm coming up on, well, no, I passed 11 months. So is it perfect? No, but guess what? I mean, whether or not I wanted to say that's what I am, that's what I am. And that's what I talk about. So I want my YouTube name to attract my tribe. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't say perfect carnivore nurse Kim. I said carnivore nurse Kim because I don't want you to think I'm talking
none
about
of us are
nursing stuff
perfect.
here.
I
I'm
don't
not.
care who you are. Nobody's perfect.
So anyway, so now it's at Carnivore Nurse Kim. Lynn is at Midlife Carnivore, and Carrie is at My Meatomorphosis with an O. Yay! Y'all come see us. Thank you.
Yeah,
I
awesome.
missed
Thank
you
you for
guys.
watching, everybody.
All right, thank you guys. We'll see y'all next week.
Yep.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.